This is GARIS Essays, that is 2-3 page opinion pieces on topics such as species dominance, the global state, politics, femtotech, religion, society and education. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is essay number 2929, entitled The Democratic Union, or DU, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Abstract. 90% of people who live outside China live in democracies. The time is now right to start a serious global push in favor of de-dictation, that is, ridding the world of the last dictatorships. The so-called international community should relabel itself as the Democratic Union, DU, and exclude those few nations that are still dictatorships, especially China, the big bad backward exception. The DU can set up criteria for membership and put moral pressure on potential applicants as insufficiently civilized to join, thus motivating the non-democratic minority to modernize, legalize, democratize and civilize. This essay describes the advantages of living in a fully democratic world and how steps should be taken to achieve it. 1. Introduction. One of the great generalizations to come out of political science in recent decades is that democratic nations are far less likely to go to war with each other. Their voting populations simply don't allow it and will vote out any warmongering political leader who threatens to do so. Our planet is wasting $2 trillion a year on arms. If the planet could become fully democratic, that is, every nation-state becomes a democracy with multiple political parties that compete in regular elections, then most of that money could be respent towards humanitarian ends. A similar argument can be made in regard to the notorious arms trade, but this time I've lost track. The biggest offenders are the advanced democracies, namely the US, Europe, and Russia, a half-democracy. If nearly all the world democratizes, and hence the number of wars per decade decreases markedly, there will be a much smaller market for arms, since there will be fewer conflicts. The arms trade, which is morally more reprehensible than the slave trade, since it is in the self-interest of slavers to keep their slaves alive, whereas the arms trade is all about killing large numbers of people, can then be sent to the dustbin of history as well. 2/3 of countries in the world today are democracies of various shades. The major exceptions are the remaining communist countries, with the biggest non-democracy being China, along with like-minded countries such as Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, etc. The world is democratizing at an average rate of about 2 countries per year. If the present trend continues, then in less than half a century from now, there will be no dictatorships left. We will be living in an entirely democratic world, a highly desirable goal for humanity to achieve. Since 2/3 of the world's population is already democratic, the time is now ripe to form a type of international club that has the main criterion for membership that a member nation must be a democracy. By forming such a club, it will become possible to put moral pressure on those non-democratic stragglers and to push them into line for the sake of world peace, the greater wealth and world happiness. This essay suggests measures that should be undertaken to de-dictate the planet, one of the main ones being the creation of a new multinational quasi-global institution called the Democratic Union, or DU for short. 2. Steps towards creating a Democratic Union, DU. A. Changing the United Nations, UN. Grassroots and multinational organizations ought to be formed with the aim of creating a DU, Democratic Union, within the United Nations, UN. Staff members of the UN should be talking amongst themselves on how such a union could be formed and within the structures of the UN. A manifesto should be written which spells out clearly the considerable advantages of the creation of such a DU, for example, those listed briefly above, that is, the removal of the last dictatorships, the riddance of war, the removal of the arms trade, the redispersion of $2 trillion wasted on arms each year towards humanitarian ends, etc. B. Getting started. A way to start would be for a handful of interested nations to join together and create the DU. It should establish criteria for membership that less democratically developed nations can aim at to become accepted members, that is, to become members of the democratic club. Once these membership criteria are established, those nations that the founder nations consider worthy to become members can be approached, and those not considered worthy will definitely not be approached. Once enough momentum has been established in the creation of the DU, it can then start applying moral pressure on the non-democratic stragglers. 3. Applying dictatorial moral pressure. Once the DU has come into being at the UN, it can begin to apply psychological pressure on the non-democratic countries, and especially towards China. It can, for example, publish each year a list of members and a list of non-members. It can arrange an annual ceremony to congratulate new members and publicise the event widely so as to bring moral pressure to bear on non-members. Those countries that are close to meeting the criteria will be encouraged to make the necessary reforms to become members, rather than the way the EU, European Union, encourages future members to make legislative changes to become EU members. DU members can keep asking non-members, "When do you plan to democratize? How does it feel to be one of the last countries in the world to democratize?" etc. Such moral pressure coming from all sides of the globe will have tremendous moral force and make the stragglers feel very uncomfortable and inferior, which is precisely the intention. In China's case, it is the only third world nation to have anti-satellite weapons, so it may be the very last country to democratize. All the other third world countries do not have the technological know-how in space technology to shoot internet satellites out of the sky, which is something China actually did a few years ago. In a mere few years, China will be the largest economy in the world, and today it actually is in purchasing power terms. So its voice in the UN will be even more powerful than it is today. Today being 2012 when this essay was written. If it feels an overwhelmingly powerful moral force against it, coming from all sides, it may choose to leave the UN, the way Japan and Italy did in the 1930s. Well, the League of Nations. But if it did that, it would lose its seat on the Permanent Security Council at the UN, and hence would have far less impact in making world decisions. With China out of the picture in that sense, it would be much easier for the UN to push pro-democratic decisions. China would thus very probably choose to remain a UN member and hence have to submit to the huge moral pressure against it. This pro-democratic bullying would be one of the explicit, or at least implicit, goals of the DU. That is, to put real moral pressure on China to democratize, the big, bad, backward exception. In a few years, we will be living in a world which is almost 80% of the world's population is democratic. The other 20% lives in China. It will become intolerable for the non-Chinese world to accept that the world's biggest economy, with the world's largest population, namely China, is a brutal dictatorship, with a government that has killed some 70 to 80 million of its own citizens. For example, 45 million, according to the latest research, in the Mao-caused Great Chinese Famine of 1958 to 62. And half of the 50 million Chinese who were sent to China's infamous Laogai, that is, the Chinese equivalent of Stalin's gulags, that is, slave labour camps for political prisoners, 3 to 5 million of them in today's China, today being 2017, who did not return, giving a total of at least 45 plus 25 million. Most of these mass murders were committed during the dictatorship of Mao Zedong, a greater mass murdering tyrant than even Hitler or Stalin, and hence history's worst, whose face is still on China's money. Even today there are still over 1,000 Laogai in China, with somewhere between 1/2 and 2 million political prisoners. If you go to Harry Wu laogaimuseum.org, the figure is now 3 to 5 million political prisoners in China, today's China. The DU, with 80% of the world population, will simply not tolerate that the world's largest economy and political power is such a moral pygmy. It will put enormous moral pressure on China to civilize. In its present state, China is simply a moral shithole. It's therefore only a question of time before the big DU, 4 times bigger than China, can put up not only moral pressure on China to modernize, legalize, democratize and civilize, but economic and political pressure as well. If the non-Chinese world truly unifies, then little China will not have a chance. It could be economically boycotted by the rest of the world. Its touristing citizens could be bombarded by moral pressure from the rest of the world. Chinese tourists could be hazed by local populations with demeaning questions such as, "Why do you Chinese tolerate living in such a political shithole? Why are you Chinese so politically backward?" The collective pressure on China would be enormous. 4. EdSats, that is, education satellites. To help put pressure on China, it will become easier as the number of non-democratic nations besides China dwindles to 0. One very effective way to do this will be to use EdSats, that is, education satellites, that beam down the internet with very high bandwidth to almost all the planet. These EdSats could beam down education programs from kindergarten level to professorial seminars, that is, all the world's knowledge, so that the intelligent, enterprising, ambitious, poor, ignorant third world peasants would be given the means to educate themselves and pull themselves out of their third world ignorance and poverty. Political science shows, based on the experience of 100 countries over the past half-century, that once the standard of living of a country surpasses $6,000 to $8,000 per person per year, its one-party dictatorship switches to a multi-party democracy. One of the major aims of the DU member states should therefore be to provide an extensive EdSat capability by sending up the satellites and beaming down the world's knowledge to dirt-cheap satellite phones that even a poor peasant can afford. The creation of an EdSat system should be one of the major goals of the DU, with a large department devoted to the purpose of the UN. By allowing third world peasants to educate themselves and hence become middle class, they will not tolerate living in a backward, poor third world dictatorship and will push for democratization. Hence, to de-dictate the planet, the DU countries should establish an EdSat system. If China threatens to shoot down any EdSats that beam down pro-democracy messages to China's peasants, then that would be reason for even greater moral pressure on China's leaders. You are deliberately keeping your citizens ignorant and poor, just so you can stay in power. You are worse than Arab dictators, and you have certainly killed more of your own citizens. You are truly morally inferior. As Chinese tourists travel and learn that China is the only country in the world not to have an EdSat service, that will make these Chinese travellers contemptuous of their own government, so that when they return to China, they will put even more pressure on their Chinese leaders to democratize. With the internet speed doubling every year and the ever-increasing number of websites with links to thousands of global radio stations or hundreds of global TV stations, it will be possible for NGOs, that's non-governmental organizations, to invite huge numbers of volunteers worldwide to contribute to a WikiLeaks type organization by sending to it the names and emails of all Communist Party members and all university professors of the remaining dictatorial countries, and to invite other volunteers to email these people excerpts from books banned in the dictatorship countries. The aim would be to educate the brainwashed and censored minds of the opinion makers of these countries with proof of the evil histories of their countries' governments. For example, in China's case, volunteers could use Google Translate to email these people about Mao's 70 million, about the 50 million that had been through the Laogai, about Deng's decision to shoot the pro-democracy students in Tiananmen Square in 1989, etc. Perhaps overseas pro-democracy Chinese or Taiwanese or Hong Kongers could help with the translations. These volunteers could consult appropriate texts containing such information to be found on the organization's website. With millions of volunteers all over the world aiming at a common goal, namely educating the elite of the dictatorial countries, the fall of these dictatorships can only be hastened. Such a dedictate.org could be set up rather easily by a small number of dedicated individuals. Perhaps the organization Hackers Anonymous might assist with this de-dictatorial cause. Once China democratizes, the major task of the DU will have been completed. It will then be possible to simply push the small stragglers into line with total economic embargoes, giving them no choice but to follow the big democratic boys. Once the whole planet is democratic, it can then pursue with greater energy the far more ambitious task of forming a global state, globa, with a global language, a culturally homogenized world population, and a world government. Hence no more wars, no arms trade, no ignorance, no poverty. But still, with the rising threat of the artellect equals ultra-intelligent machine, which will prove to be the greatest political challenge of the 21st century for the planet. That's it. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name Hugo de Garis. Ciao.